conservation community the importance of working with smallholder farmers. If we wish to conserve patches of forest or natural ecosystems that still remain in some of these farming landscapes, we need to first improve the situation of farmers who live there and make sure that they have their livelihood secured before we start talking to them about biodiversity conservation. Second, it's important that we work with, as a conservation community, that we work with development organisations to improve food security within these regions so that farmers can meet their household needs and do not need to experience the lengthy hunger periods, and that they do not need to resort to clearing new areas of land. Third, it's very important to provide these communities with additional technical assistance to improve farm productivity. When we've asked the farmers what they're interested in, what kind of help they would like from conservation organisations, they do not ask for help in delineating natural ecosystems or protected areas. What they want is help with agricultural production. They want help in improving crop productivity, livestock production. They want capacity building, access to credit, food aid, communal granaries to store their food, irrigation, wells, etc. So I think we really need to recognise that if we want to work with this community, we need to be expanding our activities into more of the sustainable development activities, which will then give us an in for achieving overall greater sustainability of the landscapes. So I'd like to end with 3 key messages. First, in many regions such as Madagascar, the future of biodiversity conservation in these landscapes really lies in the hands of smallholder farmers. Farmers are the ones who are using the landscapes, who are making decisions about the structure and composition, and that in turn will affect what biodiversity remains and what ecosystem services are being provided. As I've shown in this presentation, the farmers are highly vulnerable, not only to climate change, but other more common agricultural risks, and suffer high levels of food insecurity. And this means that any effort to engage these communities must first address their needs for more secure livelihoods and better food security. And last but not least, I think that if we can work with the farmers to improve their livelihoods and reduce their overall vulnerability, I think our success or the opportunities for succeeding at conserving biodiversity and conserving ecosystem services will be much greater. So thank you very much.
Modify the title a little bit. Anyway, so I'd like to talk with you this afternoon. We're working with smallholder farmers in Tarazu in Costa Rica, which is a coffee production landscape. This work has been done over the last few years in collaboration with a number of others listed below. The Tarazu coffee production system is just south of San Jose in Costa Rica, and it is the largest and it's the coffee production system has the greatest yield. It's also very high quality coffee in Costa Rica. Although it is maybe a sort of well-known story, coffee production in Costa Rica changed in the 1970s, 80s, and went through a sort of green revolution where they had great intensification of production there through support, development support to intensify and bring lots of fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, as well as remove a lot of the shade trees to try to boost yields. This was successful over the short term, and we had a great increase in coffee production in Costa Rica during the sort of 80s. However, as you can see, by the time you get to the 90s and the year 2000, that the system sort of turned around. And in fact, we had a reduction in production, and since the last 10, 12 years, the yield on a per acre basis or per hectare basis declined, suggesting that the system had sort of reached, had become exhausted a little bit. Secondly, there are big price fluctuations, like in a lot of commodities that impacted coffee farming in Costa Rica. So this is the sort of system that we walked into through a partnership to look at how could we look at sustainability and resilience. And so thinking about the threats to sustainability and resilience in the system, there were high reliance on external inputs, And because external inputs are expensive and because they're often tied or highly tied to oil prices, when you get spikes in the cost of oil, then these become very expensive. And given the proportion of income or investment in farming that's dedicated to inputs is very high, when you get that increase in oil price, and obviously it becomes much more expensive. Exhausted soils are also a threat, as well as outbreaks and pests and fungal pathogens, as in many agricultural systems. And obviously these fluctuating prices are very hard in terms of challenging the resilience of the coffee producers. In terms of the impacts that those threats have, it results obviously in declining yields and quality, which impacts livelihoods. This impacts the livelihoods of the rural communities, and there's a lot of loss of farmers. They left farming, reduction in amount of farmed, and this had a knock-on effect in terms of the governance structures, the institutions. Many of the cooperatives, Costa Rica has a strong cooperative structure to support their coffee farming. Went out of business. There's a lot of trust in the institutions, in the cooperatives, as a consequence of that, and there was a sort of reorganization of these institutions through that. Finally, even though there were these negative impacts through this process, opportunities also existed in terms of generating a more sustainable, resilient system. These included new financial models, either payment for ecosystem services, certification, different kinds of contractual models that existed for supporting a transition towards sustainability. There was increased knowledge about better and more sustainable practices that could be incorporated. And there was also an interested and motivated supply chain. Everyone from the consumers who are interested in bird-friendly or organic, sustainably produced coffee, through to the buyers, through to the producers, are all motivated and interested in how can we do things differently to create a more sustainable system. This is a rather sort of simplified way of looking at, thinking of the different production syndromes or systems here, where at the top here you have a more traditional, indigenous way of incorporating coffee within a more natural farm landscape or landscape, down to a sort of sun-grown coffee down here. And this is just one dimension that we can think about sustainability, but obviously incorporating vegetation, trees, and ground cover into the system will increase the sustainability. Whereas many of the systems that we've talked about tend to be more in the traditional sector, what we're really looking at here in Costa Rica, as we just talked about, is a very intensive system. And the question is, how can we get more of the sort of natural processes back into the system to increase the sustainability of the system? The program that I'm talking about has been going on for roughly the last 5 years. And there are a couple of components that we want to highlight. One is really based on partnerships. Earthwatch is not an agronomic-based institution, and we relied heavily on working with Starbucks, who funded it, but also provided a lot of technical assistance, as well as were gatekeepers and helped enter into relationships with cooperatives and the producers, working with the local cooperatives, as well as with many producers in the area. Was obviously part of that partnership framework, as well as working with other universities and institutions within Costa Rica. The second aspect that we did, and this is the angle that sort of Earthwatch looked to bring in, is a participatory research model. So Earthwatch looks at how can we support science, but also participation in the doing of science to come up with information that hopefully identifies other pathways towards sustainability. To do that, we look at engaging volunteers, many of them foreign participants, but also corporate employees, as well as looking at engaging farmers in different ways in that participatory research to help understand what are the patterns there that could lead to win-win solutions. Through consultation workshops and so on, we identified priorities, and as Celia mentioned, the priorities that emerged had to do with agronomy, had to do with the yield, had to do with soils, and that's what we started focusing on in terms of a research program that could help identify some of the patterns there. Obviously, pests and pathogens were also another priority. We decided to push that back to later. Things such as biodiversity surveys really did not come up much, and so they're sort of part of the sort of second phase of incorporating, looking at pollinators in the matrix in terms of biodiversity. terms of who's participated over the last 5 years. 100 different producers and extension officers from the different cooperatives, looking at teachers, youth, the general public. A lot of people are interested in sustainable agriculture. We went down to Costa Rica to work for 1 to 2 weeks at a time with scientists to help collect data. University researchers, Starbucks Coffee Company have had in different ways technical assistance, but also many of their employees go down and help collect data and try to understand what's happening. And we've had great success at interesting other corporate companies in getting their employees involved to understand what sustainability and what that means on the ground. In terms of some of the basic results, none of these are sort of groundbreaking kinds of results, but what we found essentially is that the net nitrogen inputs far exceeded the demands of the system, that the nitrogen being added to the system decreased the pH of the soil, increased the soil acidity, which led to a lack of availability of some basic nutrients, primarily calcium. And in fact, the more calcium you have in the system, the more coffee you get there. So it's looking at some of the mechanisms behind the activities of the farmers and the response of the coffee, both the yield as well as the taste. And by setting up a knowledge framework of what's happening within the system, we're able to work with discrete farmers and the cooperatives to be able to talk to them about modifying their practices to minimize a certain fertilizer input. Through those conversations, and again, using the specific data in those conversations, we're able to look and track to see whether farmers change their behavior. And we see over the few years that we saw on the top graph is looking at a reduction, in fertilizer application through these discussions. Overall, it was clear that they were over fertilizing. It wasn't being used by the coffee. And by that reduction, we saw that there's a response in the soil, both in terms of available calcium, in terms of pH. The blue line in the middle graph shows that the productivity of the coffee plants responded positively to the increase in calcium and in the soil pH. And so that sounded quite good. It sounded like we were having a great effect. But part of the story also is that these systems are much more complex, and the story is more complicated than that. What we found that at the same time as this was going on, the prices of fertilizer increased dramatically. And what we saw was so it wasn't simply just learning about fertilizer inputs were perhaps not good for the soil. It was easier and less painful for farmers to buy that fertilizer because the fertilizer had increased dramatically in price. As you can see in the bottom graph here, as soon as the price of fertilizer, the red, declined, then the actual application of fertilizer increased back again. And so, much as we've been talking about this afternoon, it's a long-term trajectory. We have to work through the bumps to be able to manage this and engage them in different ways. Finally, one of the things that came out, certainly for me as a lesson listening to yesterday's sessions on ecosystem-based approaches, is thinking about communication and working with different stakeholder groups. And one of the things that's come out with is that we started with science, looking at some of the agronomic relationships and being able to talk to farmers about improving win-win solutions in terms of inputs, in terms of soil, in terms of the coffee production. But out of that have come out a series of assessment and monitoring tools that they have requested that we help develop for them, and to be able to develop in a way that the language is relevant to them. Whether these are soil assessment tools, whether these are logbooks and registers, whether it's workshops to work with other farmers and to be able to spread and scale up. And also looking to expand the research beyond simply agronomy to pollinator research and look at the role of forest fragments in terms of pollination and so on. And certainly what we've found is that and so we can start tying back in more biodiversity kinds of targets into this kind of approach. This is the last slide. One of the things that we've looked at in this more intensive system is that the approaches that we found, certainly here with coffee, have see as self-reinforcing mechanisms. They're syndromes that support one another. And if we want to shift farming practices away from the sort of intensive, more degrading practices to something that's more sustainable, you sort of have to pick out apart some of these self-reinforcing mechanisms to be able to get that shift back towards a more sustainable system. As most of us have talked about, obviously there's ecological relationships and socioeconomics, but governance and institutional relationships are obviously very critical, thinking about resilience and sustainability here. In terms of specific lessons, obviously it takes time, as we've all talked about, thinking about ways that we can communicate our ideas about sustainability and ecosystem resilience in ways that make sense to farmers that they can adopt and come up with their systems to be able to match that is obviously critical. But also looking at self-assessment tools that farmers can, or producers can use to be able to sort of self-manage and monitor is obviously one of the keys to long-term success. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So far this afternoon, and even during most of the talks I've heard, we've been talking about smallholder farmers. In this case, we're going to move to a somewhat more industrial production. We will talk about viticulture, which is, of course, has nothing to do with producing essential food for humanity. But of course, in France, we consider it essential food for the spirit.